Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank the organizers at Turning Point Education. And so many of you who've dedicated your lives to education. I don't think I've ever met anybody who was successful who couldn't point to an educator who played a very important part in their lives. And in achieving the American dream, we have so many people these days who say the American dream is dead, or that it's dead for certain segments of our society. Well, I'm here today to proclaim that it is alive and well, but you have to work for it. You've always had to work for it. We've always been the can-do society, not the what can you do for me society. And that's made a very big difference in the elevation of our country from a bunch of ragtag militiamen to the pinnacle of the world in record time. And we need to hold on to that and make sure that our young people know that too. You know, as a youngster, I was not particularly well versed in educational pursuits, let's put it that way. I was called the dummy. And people teased me about it. And I thought I was dumb. My teachers thought I was dumb. All my classmates thought I was dumb. And it's a terrible feeling to just accept that and to accept that other people are smarter than you are. And sometimes it's the teacher that recognizes that someone is not dumb. In my case, I got glasses. I didn't know anybody could see the board. And when I got glasses, I immediately went from an F student to a D student. And I was so proud of myself. And the teacher said, "Benjamin, on the whole, you're doing so much better." But my mother was still quite distressed that I was doing so poorly. And the other kids just teased me mercilessly. But I really tried to act like I didn't like it or that I didn't care what they were doing. But I did care. And I did have a way of getting back at people who called me dummy. I was very good at one particular thing. Everybody's good at something. I was good at getting other people kicked out of class. Because I would study my classmates and figure out what made them really, really angry. And then I would just irritate them until they were about to explode. But I would never push the last button to make them explode until we were in class and the teacher was nearby. And then they would explode and the teacher would kick them out and I would say, "Yeah!" Because I wouldn't be the only one who didn't learn anything that day. But there was this one girl. Now, you all know this girl. Some of you were her. Miss Goody Two-Shoes. Everything perfect and pristine, made everybody else look like a total fool. I said, "Wow, wouldn't it be nice to get her kicked out of class?" There was only one problem. She was cool, calm, collected. You could not get under her skin. But I was persistent. And I finally figured out what made her angry. And she was boiling. I mean, the steam was coming out of her ears. She was ready to explode. But I didn't push the last button. I waited till we were in class. Lo and behold, she sat right down in the desk in front of me. I said, "The Lord is good." And as the teacher approached, I began to irritate her. And I pushed the last button, but she didn't explode. She just quietly turned around, said, "You and me on the playground at recess." So that didn't work out all that well. I became a brain surgeon and she became a professional wrestler. But I did stop bothering people at that point. But my mother was so distressed because she had not really had an opportunity to have a good education. Less than a third grade education. Bounced around from house to house. Never really had a place that she could call home. got married at age 13, trying to escape dire poverty in rural Tennessee. Moved to Detroit. Years later, discovered that her husband was a bigamist. Had the responsibility of trying to raise 2 young sons in the inner city by herself. And she's the wisest person that I ever met. No education, but a tremendous amount of wisdom. But she didn't know what to do because she saw both my brother and myself going down the same path, not getting a good education, and what that would mean for our futures. And she prayed. She had great faith in God. And she prayed that He would show her what to do in order to stimulate us in our educational pursuits. And God gave her the wisdom. At least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was that wise. Because it was to turn off the TV and make us read books and write book reports that she couldn't read. And she would put little check marks and underline and highlights. And we thought she was reading, but she wasn't. And I hated it at first. But after a while, I actually began to enjoy reading those books because they were about explorers and scientists, surgeons and entrepreneurs and innovators. And as I read those stories, it just broadened my horizons so much. I began to realize that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. You know, growing up, I hated poverty. Some people hate rats, some people hate roaches and snakes. I hated poverty. That is, until I started reading those books and those stories about incredible people. And then I realized that I could control my own future. I didn't have to let anybody else control it. And therefore, poverty was only temporary. And I could change that completely. And that gave me a sense of power, a sense of freedom. I got to the point where if I had 5 minutes, I was reading a book. And in the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those students who were laughing and calling me dummy, who were now coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I would say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but realize I had the same brain when I was at the top of the class that I had at the bottom of the class. So what does that mean in terms of encouraging and cultivating intellectual pursuits in our young people? So vitally important. You know, you think about the human brain, such a phenomenal organ system. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard, can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. You can't overload it. You hear people saying, don't learn this, you'll overload your brain. You can't overload the human brain. If you learned one new fact every second, it would take you more than 3 million years to begin to challenge the capacity of your brain. So it's not something that needs to be worried about. And that brain begins to develop immediately after fertilization. You know, you have a female gamete, 23 chromosomes, a male gamete, 23 chromosomes. Neither has the ability to become a human being. But then fertilization occurs and you've got a zygote with 46 chromosomes, a complete genetic map for a new individual, not a part of the mother, not a part of the father. And that brain is developing millions of neurons every day. Later on, billions of neurons every single day. Think about that. By the time a baby is born, 9 months later, that brain is still rapidly developing, which is why newborn babies sleep for 20 to 22 hours per day. And the brain continues to develop right up into your mid to late 20s. Some people it never develops, but on average, it takes that. Now think about the implications of what I just said. Not until your mid to late 20s is your brain fully developed. And yet we're in a situation where we have people telling 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds who have incompletely developed brains that they may not be a girl. They may not be a boy. Children are very suggestible, and they're very curious. And that's the reason that they have parents to protect them from predators who take advantage of that incompletely developed brain that's very curious and suggestible. And I think we have a responsibility to stop it, because it's nothing less than child abuse when we're allowing people to do that. And those of us who know better, as the Bible says in the 24th chapter of Proverbs, you see people being led away to destruction. Don't just stand by. Don't you have a responsibility? And I think we all have that responsibility to do something about it. You know, the people who are trying to fundamentally change our society, they understand all the things I just said about the brain. That's why Lenin said, "Give me your children to teach for 4 years, and the seed that I sow will never be uprooted." I don't completely agree with him on that, but it becomes very hard to uproot those seeds the longer you go. You know, by the time you're a freshman in college, if you've been going down that leftist road for a long period of time, it is very, very difficult. And that's why they swallow hook, line, and sinker all of those things that are consistent with those seeds that have been sown. And that's why we have to be every bit as aggressive in terms of planting the right kind of seeds. You know, Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it." That's a cooperative effort between parents and teachers to do that right kind of teaching. And you know, I remember a number of teachers as I was coming along that made such a big difference in my life. Mr. Jake, my 5th grade science teacher, was the first one who actually believed in me, the first one who thought that I was smart. And it made a huge difference for me. And then there was Mr. Dokes, the band teacher in high school, who realized that I was growing up without a father, took money out of his own pocket to buy essential things that I needed for band, and he knew that I couldn't afford them. But I won a scholarship to Interlochen. Some of you who know about music know that's very significant. It would have been a huge feather in his cap, first person from Southwestern High School in inner city Detroit to ever do that. And instead of rejoicing over that, he said, "Benny, don't accept it, because you're going to be a great doctor, and I don't want you to be distracted by something else." He was thinking about me rather than himself. And then there was Miss Schoenberger, who later became Ms. Miller, got married. My freshman English teacher, who took a great interest in me and saw a lot of potential. I was called her teacher's pet, but she was really just a great teacher. But in my sophomore year, I unfortunately got caught up with some gang activity, and my grades started to suffer, and she was not happy. And she said, "You keep hanging out with those gangs, you're going to die by me." And I believed her, so I stopped. But, you know, teachers play incredible roles. They have just amazing influence upon children at a time when they are very moldable. And there's very few professions that really do something like that, so it's so very important. The leftists, on the other hand, have a lot to do with the victimhood that you see and convincing people that they're victims. Because if you can do that, then it's much easier to implement class warfare and to say that those are the people who are causing your problem. And we see that increasingly in the society that we live in now. Teaching involves not only what's in the classroom, but it involves teaching students that the primary educator in their life is themselves. Most of the education that you're going to have in your entire life is self-education. So helping people to understand that they are the ones who are responsible for their education makes all the difference in the world. I remember when I was in high school, one of the TV programs we were allowed to watch was GE College Bowl. Now, most of you are too young to remember that particular program, but it came on every Sunday. And it had two colleges pitted against each other, 4 contestants on each side. And they would ask questions about science and math, history, geography. I was really good in all that stuff. And I made it my goal to be a contestant on that show. But they also asked questions about classical art and classical music. There was no way you were learning that at Southwestern High School in inner city Detroit. I mean, in my high school, if you said something about Van Gogh, they would have said, put gas in it, the van will go. They would have had no idea what you were talking about. So I made it my goal to learn all that stuff on my own. And I would get on the bus and go downtown to the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is one of the great art museums in the country. And I would roam through those galleries until I knew every picture, who painted it, when they were born, when they died, what period it represented. Listening to my portable radio, Bach, Telemann, Mozart. Kids in Detroit thought I was nuts. A black kid in Motown listening to Mozart? I tried to convince them that the Mo in Motown was Mozart, but nobody was buying it. And I even determined which college I was going to apply to based on that program, because I had enough money to apply to one college. I said, I'm applying to the college that wins the grand championship of College Ball that year. And the grand championship that year was between Harvard and Yale. And Yale demolished Harvard, so I didn't want to go to a school with a bunch of dummies. So I applied to Yale, and fortunately they accepted me with a scholarship. But the year I went there was the year College Ball went off the air. I know, it's a sad story. But there was a good thing, and that's where I met Candy, my wife. So it turned out to be a very good move. Good. But so important, the concept of self-education. Learning all that stuff on my own opened up many vistas and had a huge impact on the rest of my life. Teaching of values also. Where does that come from? You know, in the early days of our country, people learned to read from the Bible in those one-room schools. And stop and think about the implications of that. Everybody knew about the 10 Commandments. You know, there are arguments going on right now about posting the 10 Commandments in public schools and how that violates the Establishment Clause. But think about it. Does it really? Are not those things that are common to civilizations everywhere? You can go to the deepest, darkest jungle of Borneo. And the thief who has never read the Bible or seen a missionary, he waits till nighttime to steal. Why does he do that? Because he doesn't want anybody to see him. Why doesn't he want anybody to see him? Because he knows it's wrong. People know those things. So we should boldly ask the question, what's wrong with thou shalt not steal? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not envy, thou shalt not lie. What is wrong with those concepts? And in the time since we abandoned those in 1963, have things gotten better? Has our society improved? Has our morality gotten better? Or are we going in a different direction? And I think education should include values. How do we treat each other? And that's one of the reasons that we established the American Cornerstone Institute, and particularly the Little Patriots program, which is part of American Cornerstone. Because we want our young people to know who we are, what the values were that were so important in the establishment of this country. Our faith, and how that teaches us how to relate to each other. Judeo-Christian values teach us to love your neighbor, not cancel your neighbor if they have a different yard sign. Liberty. The concept of liberty is so vitally important. The reason that so many people are attracted to this country. You can live the life that you want as long as it's not interfering with someone else's life. Now, Candy and I have visited 68 countries, and we've lived overseas. And regardless of what anybody says about this country, they say we're systemically racist, we are unfair to people. If we were all that bad, why are so many people trying to get in here? And, you know, my telephone is going off. And it's a member of President Trump's cabinet, but I'll have to call him back. But why are they all trying to get in here if we're so bad? Think about that. And then the concept of community, so vitally important. And no, I'm not going to do it. But the concept of community, so vitally critical and important, because in the early days of this country, if somebody got hurt, and a large number of people were involved in agricultural endeavors, someone got hurt during harvest time, guess what? All of the neighbors would harvest their crops. They wouldn't ask them what their political affiliation was or what their religious affiliation was. All they knew is that that's my neighbor and they need help. This is some value that we must inculcate into our young people once again. We are not enemies. W-A-N-E, wane. We've let hatred and division wax for a long time. Now it's time to let it wane. It's so vitally important to the influence that we have, not only on our neighbors and in our neighborhood, but on the entire world. I think there was a reason that God allowed this country to ascend into a leadership position. I think there's a reason that a year ago, God spared the life of President Trump. You know, think about this. During the Battle of Monongahela, during the French and Indian War, all the couriers were killed except George Washington. He had 2 horses shot from beneath him. He had 4 bullet holes in his overcoat, no flesh wounds. God clearly saved him. And some years later, when he was back in the area, still before he became president, one of the Indian chiefs that had been involved in that war wanted to meet him. He asked his braves to bring him to see George Washington. And he said, "Sir, before I die, I wanted to meet you because I'm an expert marksman, and I shot you 17 times. And my men shot you, and pretty soon I told them to stop wasting their bullets. And I just wanted to meet the man who was spared by the Great Spirit above and was destined to become the father of a great nation." That story used to be in all of our history books before it was decided that it was politically incorrect. But Butler, Pennsylvania, is only 59 miles away from Monongahela, where another future president was spared by the God in heaven. And we shouldn't be ashamed of our relationship with God. I think it makes all the difference in the world. We need to be brave in proclaiming what we believe in. You know, in 1831, when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, ostensibly to study our penal system, and he studied everything, and he was impressed by our government, our separation of powers. And then he looked at our business environment. He was so impressed with how we encourage entrepreneurship and innovation. And he looked at our educational system, and he could find a mountain man in the woods, and the guy could read. The guy could tell him about the Declaration of Independence. But the thing that impressed him most were the sermons that came out of the churches. And in his 2-volume set, Democracy in America, he ended by talking about those fiery sermons that inspired a ragtag bunch of militiamen to defeat the most powerful military force on earth and gave the people a moral basis for living. And he concluded that 2-volume set by saying, "America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And it is our responsibility to make sure that America is good, to ensure that greatness for the future." Thank you all for what you do.